Hey everyone. I'm going to be the one that is doing your DBQ video right now, and you deserve explanation for why I'm doing that. Um, the reasoning behind that is that Mr. Mitchell has been under quite a bit of stress, as you can imagine. Um, which resulted in his blood pressure reaching near hospitalization levels, and he's been ordered by his doctor to not do really any intensive work like that. But uh, rest assured that he's given me everything that I need uh, in order to teach this to you. And I've looked over it for hours on end now, making sure that I know what I'm doing and can get you prepared enough to do well in this exam that's coming up on May the 15th. So we have talked about it quite a bit. He's explained to me what I need to say and so forth to have you aware of what's going on this essay. So the first thing I need you to do is take out or pull up, however you're going to do it, the blank worksheet. And as I go along, I'm going to be kind of talking through each section of that worksheet, and I want you to take notes on the side in that blank column, and we will kind of go from there. But you'll be turning that in Canvas for a grade. Also, I'm going to need you to pay attention to the 5 historical figures that I mentioned in this video. Hint, hint, that's very important for the quiz coming up. First historical figure is George Washington. Okay, so I'm going to pull up the sheet here through screen sharing, and we will kind of talk through it from there. But what we're going to do is kind of just go through this worksheet, and it is this one. So first thing first, whenever you're writing any essay, is a thesis statement. For this exam, it's just like the LEQ, and that's something that I want to mention really quickly here, is that the DBQ is nothing more than an extension of the LEQ. You take what you've been doing, and it actually says here at the bottom, the argument format is the same. The only difference is that your ammunition has changed. Instead of coming up with evidence out of your head, you actually get to read a document and pull evidence from a document. And in that sense, it makes it easier, in my opinion. So what we're going to do is just talk through that. The first point here doesn't really require much clarification. Your thesis statement, it just needs to answer the prompt. It cannot just restate the prompt. You need to make sure that it's 1 to 2 sentences long and that it directly answers your question. And within that thesis statement, you need to have around 2, they call it categories of support. And what that means is that if the question is, what's a cause of the Civil War? And you say a cause of the Civil War is slavery, then that would be your category of support. That's what that means. Finally, and probably most importantly, is that you need to rank your categories. So if it's a comparison essay or a continuity or a causation essay, no matter what the type, you need to make sure that you're saying a major cause was this, a minor cause was that. Because when you're doing that, they're going to ask you probably to evaluate the extent to which whatever. And the way you evaluate the extent to which is through those words like major or minor. Those are the 2 words that I personally recommend. So that's what a thesis statement is. And you should be familiar with this now because of the LEQs you've been writing. Next kind of section here that we're going to talk about is the 3 types. You can have comparison, a causation, or continuity and change over time. Now, no one knows what the College Board is going to ask of you, but the chances are pretty high that it will be either causation or continuity and change over time. Those are the most popular ones, but we're going to have you prepared for all 3 because they could be any of the 3. A comparison, all you're doing is arguing what is similar and what's different between 2 things. So, you know, you would have one, and the kind of format of this essay is really simple. One paragraph for similarities, one paragraph for differences. Very similar, or excuse me, one for similarities, one for differences. And this can be between a lot of different things. It can be between two groups of people, two regions of the country, two events like first industrial revolution, second industrial revolution, stuff like that. That's the basis for a comparison essay. Okay, next one that you need to write down, causation. It's pretty similar. You argue what's the causes or the effects of some event. The College Board will not ask you for causes and effects anymore like they have in the past. It'll just be the causes or the effects. So you'd have one body paragraph for a cause, another body paragraph for another cause. Or effect. So you'd have one body paragraph for effect and a second body paragraph for effect. It just depends on what they say, but they will tell you whether they're going to ask for a cause or an effect. It won't be both. It won't be both. And finally, the continuity and change over time. You're arguing what changes or what stays the same. They will specify whether they are looking for continuities and changes, or just continuities, or just changes. They could ask any of those three, but they will specify. That's the only one that can be an and or. With comparison, you need to argue the similarities and the differences. With causation, it will be either causes or effects, but not both. Continuity and change over time, it can be any. It can be just continuity, just change, or it can be continuity and change that they want you to address in the essay. So that kind of, it should be familiar with what you're familiar with already because of the LEQs you've been writing in class. Next point is something that you should be familiar with already from the LEQs. That is your contextualization paragraph. It comes right after your introduction or your thesis paragraph. It needs to be around 3 to 5 sentences long, but it can obviously vary based on how how many pieces of evidence you have, the way you structure your sentences, etc. But think of this sort of like that opening crawl on a Star Wars movie, where it's just basically giving you the background that leads up to the movie. So you're going to give like kind of the definition that I'm reading here. You're giving historical context to the subject of the prompt. All that means that you're just giving background to it. So we're just going to use the slavery example. And before I use the slavery example, the second historical figure is Thomas Jefferson. I recommend writing these down. It will be very helpful for the quiz. Second historical figure, Thomas Jefferson. But back to the slavery example, you might give background of maybe the Southern economy. You might say the Southern economy is based off of agriculture, and that gives background to slavery because it sort of explains why the Southern part of the country would need slaves to harvest crops from their agricultural economy. Something else that you're going to look for is describing overall trends in contextualization. You might say, you know, sectionalism, it was a growing trend from really the time of the Revolution to the time of the Civil War, that whole antebellum era that you're used to talking to in class. That's a trend. Sectionalism is a trend. Religious trends, you know, that's a common example you can use. You know, over time, the country became more or less religious. Maybe if you're talking about the Second Great Awakening, you can say the country became less religious, which made people wanting to, you know, kind of revive the church, so to speak. But, and this is really, really important, so you need to make note of this. You cannot sort of double dip your evidence. And what I mean by that is that anything you use in the contextualization paragraph cannot, I repeat, cannot be used in your body paragraphs. You cannot also, because this is a DBQ, you cannot take information from the documents and use it in your contextualization paragraph. That's double dipping. You'll get the point either in contextualization or in the body paragraph, but you won't get points in both places. So you cannot double dip. If you mention, for example, the Second Great Awakening in your contextualization paragraph, don't mention it. You cannot mention it in your body paragraphs, or you won't get points for the body paragraph. again, don't double dip your information from the documents. That's very, very important. So all of that should be stuff that you're relatively familiar with. Now we're going to get into the evidence part. This is how you write the body paragraphs of a DBQ. The third historical figure is Abraham Lincoln. Third historical figure is Abraham Lincoln. So when you're writing your body paragraphs, the thing is, and this, like I said, when I showed you at the bottom, it's very similar. It's the exact same format as an LEQ. You're just using information from the documents. And tomorrow, in tomorrow's video, we'll talk about how, you know, you're supposed to word the document that you're using for your evidence. But we'll get to that in tomorrow's video. We're just going over the rubric now. So to get this point, you have the option. You can get 1, 2, or 3 points from, I don't know what happened there, from the document. So on your DBQ, it's a modified DBQ. Instead of having, 7 documents, or it might be 8 or 9 documents, I'm not sure. You're only gonna have 5 documents. That I'm sure of. So to get all of those 3 points, you're going to have to use the content from at least 4 of the documents. That's the key kind of phrase here, using content from 4 of the documents. So you're going to read through those documents, and you have to pick 4 documents to use in your paper or in your essay, your modified DBQ. Here's the important point. You cannot, I repeat, do not quote anything at all from the document. You have to put it in your own words. If you remember back to your document analysis packets, the second section was the document summary, putting it in your own words. That was prepping you for the DBQ because you cannot quote anything from these documents. So to get 3 points, which is the most points you can earn from evidence from the documents, you have to use at least 4 documents. I recommend, and I highly recommend, using all 5 documents because it sort of gives you a fallback. If you use one document incorrectly, then you still have 4 you can fall back on. Whereas if you only use 4, you use one of them incorrectly, then you're going to be bumped down to 0.2, getting 2 points for this section instead of all 3 points. So the content of the documents, this is the second part here, you have to use it in response to the prompt. So if it's asking about the causes of the Civil War, for example, and that's sort of the theme I'm running with when I'm giving you an example, if there's a speech from, maybe a abolitionist senator, maybe a speech from Thaddeus Stevens, arguing that, slavery is a humanitarian, scourge on the country, then you could say that a cause of the Civil War was slavery. And then you could use that document as your support saying, in this document, et cetera. Actually, I'm going to show you how to word that. You're not going to say in this document, but that would be the document you'd use to support that claim that a cause of the Civil War was slavery, using that document. So you're going to have to use evidence from beyond the documents. So we'll get back to how you're going to introduce it in just a second, but here's the final 2 pieces of evidence you'll use. So again, 4 documents, 4 kind of paraphrased or summarized content from the documents, now evidence beyond the documents. And if you remember back to your document analysis packet, there was a section for outside information. This is your outside information. So those are very helpful for you as you're writing the DBQ. But to earn both of those points, so your 4th and your 5th point, you're going to have to use a second piece of historical evidence beyond what is found in the documents. So if we're going to our kind of Civil War causes theme, you're not going to, excuse me, if there's you have your list of documents, and one of those documents does not talk about bleeding Kansas, then you can use Bleeding Kansas as an outside piece of evidence, and that would get you one of these points. And then you'd have to use another piece of outside evidence to get the second point related to the causes of the Civil War. But the key thing here is that the response, or excuse me, the piece of evidence that you use has to be outside of the document. So you cannot use anything from the documents and then get the point for evidence beyond the documents. It has to be something outside of the documents, your outside information. So here's another thing that's a little bit different than the LEQ. But again, it's going to be familiar because of those document analysis packets you've been doing. So you can get 1, 2, or 3 points. Actually, the third point is kind of something that you're already used to. So let's just focus on point 1 and point 2 right now. For two documents, you're going to have to use evidence, or excuse me, your analysis, which is your HIP analysis. And so when you're doing this, you're going to need a the chart that you've been using for your HIP, and you're going to need to use one of those pieces of HIP to introduce the document. So you might say something like, if we're going back to the theme of Charles Sumner or Thaddeus Stevens giving a speech, you might say, from the point of view of an abolitionist senator, and then you'd go into your document content. That would get you the point for HIP, because you're explaining the point of view, purpose, historical situation, or the audience. So you'd be explaining his point of view. If you do that twice, then you get both of those points. I recommend that whenever you use a document, which you're going to do 5 times, you use HIP every single time to introduce it. We'll talk about that more tomorrow when we go over an example. And if you don't really understand this rubric now, that's okay. Tomorrow when we go into more detail and get to an example DBQ, it'll make a lot more sense. But you're going to introduce your document with HIP, like I was saying. If you're going to use content from a speech from Thaddeus Stevens, for example, you would say, from the point of view or the historical situation, you might say, in the antebellum era, Charles Sumner gave a speech in which he said, etc. If you do that for 2 documents, you get both of those points. Again, recommend doing it for all 5 so you'll have fallback. It's always good to do yourself a favor when you're writing an essay when you can. Always have a fallback. And that will help you if you kind of misuse one of them. But remember that whenever you're doing this, you cannot just mention the HIP component. You need to make sure you explain why it is significant. So you might say, with his point of view, why is it significant that Charles Sumner was an abolition senator? Well, the abolition movement was growing within the nation, and that would get you the point, because you're explaining just not what his point of view was, but why was his point of view important. That would get you the point. And again, we'll talk more about that in the example tomorrow. But you have to give sort of the importance of whatever you're using. So that is HIP, point 1 and point 2. That relates to HIP. Again, try using more than 2. I recommend all 5 so you have fallback. Whenever you're writing a HIP component, you need to make sure that you asterisk the HIP component, which will kind of make it look weird with the evidence that you're using from the outside information or the document. But that's the way to make sure that you're including it. It'll give you some background for that. Before we go into point 3 here under analysis and reasoning, the 4th historical figure is Theodore Roosevelt. 4th historical figure is Theodore Roosevelt. So the last point in this document is point 3. And this is, again, something that you should be used to because of the LEQ. It's the complex understanding point. So this should be your kind of concluding paragraph, or it should be in your conclusion right before you restate the thesis. And so you can use connections within and across time periods. So that's a historical parallel. You're basically explaining, well, this, whatever topic I'm writing about, was similar to this topic in a different time period. So the point of that is trying to show you that history can sort of rhyme, or that there's a lot of similarities across time periods. The second one is where you consider alternative views or evidence. That's basically a counter argument. So if you're saying, such and such was a change, then you could counter argue that by saying, well, it really wasn't a change, and here's why. Um, yeah, it has to be part of your argument. You just can't say, oh, there's a change. Explain what the change was and why it was actually a change. If you was arguing a continuity in your body paragraphs, then flip to change for your counter argument. With that in mind, let's go to the fifth historical figure. And the fifth historical figure is going to be Lyndon Johnson. Fifth historical figure is Lyndon Johnson. So with that in mind, the last thing you need to do in an essay is restate your thesis, which again, you're kind of buying yourself some more opportunities to earn that point. If your thesis in your first paragraph was not strong enough, then you might can get it in the second time around. But again, that's sort of an introduction to the DBQ. We will get into more detail in the future tomorrow when we're going over an example. But if you make sure that you have filled out this document, the worksheet here, take the quiz next with the historical figures. If you wrote down those historical figures, it'll be a guaranteed 100. Make sure that you submit this worksheet in Canvas and take the quiz. Tomorrow we'll start kind of giving you some actual background of what we talked about today. But that is just a rubric you'll be graded on. We'll go over an example tomorrow. It should make a lot more sense to you if it doesn't already. Again, just remember, it's just an extension of the LEQ that you've been writing in class so far. Again, Mr. Mitchell's having some health problems, and that's why I'm doing this. You can kind of think of me as a virtual substitute, so to speak. But, like again, I promise that I have thoroughly researched this and know how to teach this to you, talking to Mr. Mitchell, who gave me prep for it, and so forth. If you have any questions, or especially if you have good kind of messages to send Mr. Mitchell during this kind of rough time, email him. He still has access to his email. I'm sure that he would love to get them. Any questions you have, you can send them to him. I'm also going to give you my email address in case you want to ask me a question about something specifically I said in the video that Mr. Mitchell would not know about. I'm going to share my screen with you one more time. Yeah. So that's my email address. You can email me there. Any questions you have, I'll give it to you again tomorrow. But that seems to be it for today. Hope you're doing well. Hope you're staying safe, most importantly. If you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'll be glad to help you out with whatever you have going on. Again, submit the worksheet, take the quiz, and I will be talking to you tomorrow.